400 stanzas. On the Middle Way. With commentary by Gyel-tsap. Chapter 14. Refuting Extreme Conceptions. Question: if, like the ring formed by a firebrand and so forth, worldly existence, because of being a dependent arising, does not exist inherently, what has inherent existence? Answer: not the slightest thing has inherent existence. Anything existing by way of its own entity would not rely on anything else at all, but not the least thing is independent or exists without relying on something else. If anything existed inherently, independence would be established as its nature when examined by the reasoning which investigates the ultimate, yet this does not exist anywhere. A mode of existence of phenomena not merely posited by nominal convention is known as independent existence, existence by way of their entity, existence by way of their character, inherent existence and true existence. This clearly indicates the object of negation through whose refutation there is no focus for conceptions of true existence. Since Candrakirti's commentary repeatedly mentions qualifying the object of negation, when refuting fabrications of true existence, one should not deprecate the Madhyamika view.
If the composite known as pot exists by way of its own entity, are the visible form and the pot one or different? In the first case it follows that the form and the pot in the statement, "the form is a pot," are not inherently one, otherwise there would be a pot wherever there was a visible form. One might think that the pot, which is something distinct from visible form, possessed form the way Gyel-tsap possesses a cow, as something separate. However, it follows that the pot which has form is not inherently separate from the form, otherwise it would be apprehensible independently of its form. The pot does not have form as something apart which depends upon it, nor does the form have a pot dependent upon it, like a dish and its contents, because neither exists inherently. Vajesica assertion: though the pot and its form are not different substantial entities, existence and the pot are. The pot is a substantial entity and is said to exist through its connection with the great generality, existence, which is something separate from it.
Answer: existence and the pot are seen to have the dissimilar characteristics of a generality and of a specific. It is not feasible for the pot to be a substantial entity which is separate from existence, for if it were, why would existence not be a separate entity from the pot? It follows that it would be. If this is accepted, the pot is non-existent. Assertion: the substantial entity, the pot, exists because it acts as a basis for attributes, such as 1 and 2, which are distinct from it. Answer: attribute and substantial entity are different words and have different meanings. If the number 1 is not accepted as the pot is not 1 either because, like 2 and so forth, these are different words and have different meanings. If this is accepted, the term and thought, 1, do not validly apply to the pot. Assertion: the pot is 1 by virtue of possessing the attribute 1, but 1 is not the pot.
Answer: possession occurs between two similar things, as in the case of consciousness, and not between dissimilar things. Moreover, there is no reciprocal possession between the pot and 1, since the pot possesses 1, but 1 does not possess the pot. The pot is also not 1 because of being a separate entity from 1. Furthermore, your contention that attributes qualify substantial entities but that one attribute does not qualify another is contradictory. If the size of the substantial entity, the pot, and the size of its visible form are the same, why is the attribute form not large just as the substantial entity is large? One must accept that the form has a separate attribute, large. Objection: small and large cannot qualify form, for according to our textual system, one attribute does not qualify another.
Answer: if your opponents were not from a school other than your own, you could cite your textual system to fault their argument, but it is inappropriate here, since we are engaged in rejecting these very tenets. Assertion: even if distinct attributes like separateness are refuted, the pot which they characterize is not refuted and thus exists by way of its own entity. Answer: if one contends that existence and so forth have the characteristic of accompanying things while the pot has the opposite characteristic, then by virtue of this opposite characteristic the pot it characterizes does not exist anywhere by way of its own entity. Such a thing, distinct from numbers like 1, 2, and so forth, has no existence as a pot established by way of its own entity. In brief, something characterized which is a different entity from its characteristics and characteristics which are different entities from that which they characterize cannot be found. Sautrantika assertion: the pot and its 8 substantial particles are one truly existent entity.
Answer: it follows that the pot would not be a truly single unit, because it is, by way of its own entity, one with and not separate from its 8 substantial particles which have diverse characteristics. Assertion: the pot is a plurality. Answer: in that case there should be a pot for each of the 8 substantial particles. Since there is no pot for each, the pot is not feasible as a plurality. Assertion: the pot is a single unit through the coming together of the 8 substantial particles. Answer: the pot's composite can in no way be a truly existent single unit due to the coalescence of the 8 substantial particles such as visible form and so forth, because the 4 elements which are tangible and visible form, smell and so forth which are intangible cannot touch and coalesce. Assertion: even though there is no mutual contact, their combination is the truly existent pot.
Answer: the pot's visible form is a component or part of the pot and thus, for a start, is not the pot, just as smell and so forth are not. Assertion: since a compound reliant upon its components exists, that is the pot. Answer: since visible form, smell and so forth do not each have a pot, the compound pot does not exist by way of its own entity. The components, too, therefore do not exist by way of their own entity, because they have parts. Why are some things that have form pots and other things that have form not pots? It follows that all should equally be pots, for if the definition that form is simply that which is appropriate as form applies without any incongruity to all forms such as smell, taste and so forth as well as pots and woolen cloth, truly existent things with form should be the same in all respects. It follows that form, smell and so forth would also be one, because of being one with the pot. Objection: form, smell and so forth are different.
Answer: you assert that smell, taste, and so forth are distinct from visible form because they are objects apprehended by different senses, but that visible form is not distinct from the pot. Yet how can the pot that cannot be posited without taste and so forth, which are distinct from form, not be distinct from form? It follows that it should be, because the pot is different from form, smell and so forth by way of its own entity. Since form and so forth are not the pot's causes by way of their own entity, the pot is not in effect existent by way of its own entity. Thus there is nowhere a pot that exists by way of its own entity apart from its components like visible form and so forth. Since a pot cannot be found isolated from its components, a pot which is a different entity from them does not exist. Assertion: the pot is the effect of its components, such as clay, and they are its causes. Answer: